You're listening to the Divorce and Your Money Show, the #1 divorce podcast in the United States. I'm your host, Sean Lehman, MBA and certified divorce financial analyst. Be sure to get a copy of my new book called, surprise, surprise, Divorce and Your Money, How to Avoid Costly Divorce Mistakes. You can get a copy on Amazon or by visiting divorceandyourmoney.com. While you're on the website, be sure to book a strategy session with me. We have 30-minute strategy sessions, and you have two options. One in which where you can just speak directly about issues that apply to you, regardless of whether you're at the beginning of the divorce, thinking about what you want to do, in the middle, trying to figure out the right path to take, or at the end of your divorce and you're trying to figure out the best options for you. And also there we have a document review appointment where we can review your financial affidavit, your divorce settlement, or other documents related to your divorce, and also include a strategy session on top of that to make sure that whatever you're preparing or about to sign is in your best interest. With that, on to this week's episode. It's been a few months since I recorded a new episode, and not because I haven't been working, but because I've been working a little too much and got behind on the podcast episode. So apologies for that. Thank you for all the people who I've been speaking to over the past several weeks and months. There have been lots and lots of good questions and coaching calls coming in. And I want to get back in helping educate you on the different intricacies of the divorce process. In this episode specifically, I want to talk about some subjects that have been coming up quite a bit. And the first one I'd like to talk about is how do you keep your separate property separate, and also how do you know if separate property, or what's being called separate property, is actually marital property. And if you've been listening to other episodes, you know what I'm talking about in the context, but the big issue is, let's say you had some money. When I say property, it could be something like money, it could be a physical property, it could be, a retirement account, a car, whatever. Let's say you had something before you got married. How do you make sure that if you're now unfortunately facing divorce, that is still considered separate property? What kind of things can you do or should you be doing? And conversely, if your ex-spouse, for instance, is saying, well, this is separate property, but you think it's actually something that you should be splitting between the two of you, how do you broach and go down that discussion? It's a very common topic that comes up every few days in terms of people that I get to speak with. And there's a few things to consider here. And let's take it from the perspective of you have some separate property. Maybe you got an inheritance, as maybe you had something when you got married. There's a lot of different types of separate property. How do you make sure that it stays separate? A few things. First is keep good records. Now, keeping good records doesn't ensure that something is separate, stays separate. However, keeping good records can ensure that you can at least be able to prove the argument one way or another in terms of what is going on. So you need to make sure that you can keep good records. Now, it becomes a challenge when sometimes you've been married for, someone called me, I spoke to just the other day, who'd been married for 31 years, and there was a separate property question, and there's no way to get the records. And so we were talking about some advanced strategies in terms of getting affidavits from a parent who's still around and other siblings who are on the receiving end of this inheritance when everyone got the same amount, et cetera, et cetera. In lieu of being able to have actual records, they had to approach a different direction. But if you have things like bank accounts or old account statements, some of these institutions keep account statements for a decade or more, or if you walk straight into your bank, sometimes they can if you've used the same bank for a long time and they're still around, oftentimes they have good records that go back further than what you may be able to ask or access online or just get when you stroll in if you just talk to a casual person at the bank. But anything you can do to get old records, old communications that indicates when you received some form of property and how much it was at the time can bolster your case. The second thing is avoid commingling. Commingling is a term that if you listen to the podcast, you should have heard before, but commingling is just the idea that you mix your separate assets with your marital assets. Simple as that. And what does that mean?
Well, let's just say you got an inheritance, and then you got an inheritance of $100 and you put 50 of it into your joint checking account. Well, now you have commingled that money, and then you spend that $50 on groceries. Well, is that still separate property? And the answer is it gets really tough, and you're probably dealing with marital property at that point, and there's not much for you to do. But if you keep that $100 that you got as an inheritance in its own bank account, and you didn't ever put your spouse's name on it, and you didn't touch it for normal family purposes, then you will have a much better shot at keeping that account separate. Now, of course, you always need to have your records, and you need to always keep that account in your name. And if you're adding and subtracting to that account, all of a sudden the math gets messy unless you have those records. But it is something that is doable, and the cleaner you keep that separate property, the easier it'll be to prove that it is separate property in the context of divorce. And conversely, I said I was taking this from the perspective of the person who has a separate property. Well, if your spouse is the one who's claiming it's separate property and they don't have these things, that presents a good case for you to say, well, hold on a second, maybe this isn't separate property. This should probably or may need to be considered marital property. And so for these different issues or different tips I'm giving, if you're the person who's on the other side of this, these are things that you should be thinking about bringing up to advocate for yourself to make that separate property marital, particularly if some of these things don't exist. So 1 is keep good records. 2 is avoid commingling. The third thing is keep track of income and dividends from separate property. And now this is a very tricky one, and this is very state specific. And I always say when someone calls, I say this is technical. And when I say this is technical, I mean each state can be very different in how they interpret this, and so you really need to have a knowledgeable lawyer in terms of understanding what I mean by this point. Keep your income and dividends separate. Well, let's just say you have a bank account with $100 in it and you get 1% interest a year on that account. Well, with that 1% interest, you're earning $1 a year. Well, that $100 that is in some states, the $100 is almost always going to be separate property. However, that $1 in interest in some states is considered marital property. So if you're earning interest on an account, the $100 is separate, but $1 is marital. And if you think about that over time, where after year 2, you have a little bit over $102, year 3, et cetera, well, if you think about those earnings over time, that can add up to become a substantial amount. I'm just using the context of a simple savings account, but some of you have retirement accounts that pay lots of dividend and interest, and there's a lot of appreciation in them. And you need to really have a discussion with your attorney as to, well, is it all separate or all marital, or is there some combination of the two? Sometimes that separate property that you thought you did everything right, well, that income and dividends may actually be marital property that you have to split, and now all of a sudden the picture certainly shifts for you. So something to really think about and know the laws in your specific state on that one. And it gets tricky. And so what you may want to do if you're thinking about, or if you have separate property, I should say, using my example of you have $100 in separate property and you get $1 in interest a year, well, maybe you want to put that $1 in interest always goes to a different account. Now, that different account may still just have your name on it. That different account you might not touch anyways. However, for an accounting perspective and trying to figure out what's part of the marital pool later down the line, having that separate account is a good way to pursue that and to figure that out. The fourth thing I want to discuss is consider getting a post-nuptial agreement. Now, look, post-nuptial agreements are very tough. Now, sometimes you may have a prenup which deals with these things, but if you're listening to this podcast, getting a prenup is a little too late. But if your state allows for post-nuptial agreements, that may be a way to keep separate property separate. Now, not every state allows for post-nuptial agreements, but if your state does and your spouse is willing to negotiate with you on it, then that is something to consider that can make the math and at least simplify part of the divorce discussion later down the line. Now, post-nuptial agreements can happen in a few different circumstances that I see most common. It's hard to be married for 8 years and then in year 9 you say, I want a post-nup. Like that's a tricky proposition. I mean, if you can do it, then great, but that's normally not the situation in which I see postnuptial agreements. One of the situations I see postnuptial agreements a lot is right at the time of separation. So, if there's something going on, for example, I'll give you an example of something that happened recently. As a business owner separating from their spouse, the only thing the business owner wanted is that if that business owner does some sort of deal with the business after the time of separation, that the spouse isn't entitled to that. Now, the spouse still gets any portion of the business before they separated and their value, their fair share. But in this case, this business person wanted to keep things separate, and that's going to enable this person to run their business as they see fit for as long as they're separated. I mean, it's a question of they're still trying to work things out. So they may get back together, they may get divorced, they don't know. But as long as they're living separately, they got a post-nup. Or, another time I see post-nups is after a new marriage when you're older. I mean, there's a window of time where it's acceptable to ask for a post-nup. But, if you are in a position where a post-nup makes sense and you may be able to ask for it, consult an attorney, and it's a good time to think and can help keep separate property separate. So those are just some things to think about in terms of keeping separate property separate. Or, as I said, if you're the person and your spouse is arguing, well, this is separate property, and they can't provide some base level information or provide the details on some of these things, then it may not totally be separate. It may actually be marital property that you're entitled to a share of. Now, the last thing I want to mention on this point that's very relevant is that sometimes things aren't clear and there are shades of gray. And so oftentimes separate property is not 100% separate, and there is a marital component to it. I'll give you a very common example. Let's just say you had a house before you got married, and that house you bought before you got married, and then a few years later you get married, your spouse moves into that house, you have your kids, blah, 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 blah. Now, let's say that you decide to renovate the house or put an addition on the house. You put in a new deck or a new roof, a new floor, or another add-on addition to the house, whatever the case may be, and that addition to the house substantially improves the home's value. Well, under that case, oftentimes, maybe I'm just making up these numbers, but 70% of the house might be separate property, but the 30% of the house value may be marital property because of some of those additions you made to it and some commingling and gray areas. It is a very tough and confusing and complicated area of family law that applies all the time. And so the goal I always talk about with people is, all right, well, let's figure out all the ways we can argue that this is going to be separate property, or if it's your spouse, all the ways we can argue this should actually be marital property. And let's just make the best case for you, because oftentimes it's not going to be 100% in one person's bucket or 100% in the other person's bucket. And there are a lot of shades of gray when it comes to separate property and keeping separate property separate and marital property. So the four things just to think about and keep on the top of your mind as you're thinking about separate and marital property and the best ways to keep it separate or prove that it's not separate. First is having good records. The second is to avoid commingling. The third is keep track of the income and dividends. And finally is a post-nuptial agreement if that is available or if you had one in place.
Now, before you go, I want to make sure you get some really important information. I'm going to tell you about a few things that may be of interest to you. First, as a favor, is if you could leave a review. If you're on the iTunes store, leave a review on iTunes, or if you search Divorce and Your Money on a website called Trustpilot or on Google, you can leave a review there. It's quick, it's anonymous, it only takes a few seconds, and I really, really appreciate your feedback. I have lots of reviews on iTunes and on Trustpilot, and I appreciate hearing your stories. Also, on divorceandyourmoney.com, you can get lots of great information. Of course, you can book a 30-minute strategy session directly with me. There's two types of strategy calls you can book. Just a normal strategy session where we discuss the questions that are most pressing to you, regardless of where you are in the divorce process, be at the beginning, towards the end, or in the middle. Doesn't really matter. There's lots of great information we can cover during that strategy call. And also, we have a document review call. It's been one of the biggest things that we've done over the past year, which is you can send me your documents, be it your financial affidavit, a settlement agreement, or other documents that you would like for me to review. And then I review those in advance of the call. And then we get to discuss them in depth as part of a strategy session and get specific answers to some of the specific documents and things that you are considering. Also, for those who need ongoing support, we do have a few options for ongoing support, but regardless, it all starts with a coaching call that you can book at divorceandyourmoney.com. Don't forget to also get a copy of my new book. It's called Divorce and Your Money: How to Avoid Costly Divorce Mistakes. It's available on my website or also on Amazon. You just look me up and make sure you get the new edition. It is filled with excellent information regarding the divorce process, and I know that you will find it helpful. And once you've read the book, be sure to leave a review. That really helps me. I appreciate your feedback, and it also helps other people as they try and find this information. And finally, last but not least by any means, is on the store at divorceandyourmoney.com. If you click on the store button, you can get access to the full archive of podcast episodes. There's over 200 episodes, and what's great about the store link is that the episodes are organized in neat buckets. And they're organized by topic, so it's very easy to follow along with the information. And it is easy to pick out the key topics that matter most to you. And you can get all of those podcast episodes in the store. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Sean Lehman, MBA and Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. Take care.